Well, Apple beat on earnings in the second quarter as a surprise growth in its iPhone business and strong services unit helped drive momentum. On the earnings call, Apple CEO Tim Cook expressed major optimism on the outlook for India and emerging markets in particular.
Looking at the business in India, we did set a quarterly record and grew very strong double digits year over year. So it was quite a good quarter for us. Taking a step back, India is an incredibly exciting market. It's a major focus for us. I was just there, and the dynamism in the market, the vibrancy is unbelievable.
Let's bring in TD Cowen Managing Director Krish Sankar to discuss all things Apple. Krish, it's good to see you. I know there's a lot to talk about, but let's just start on what we just heard Tim Cook saying, since we just played that clip of him talking about India. Obviously, Apple's investing a lot in India, in manufacturing. The market there, though, in terms of consumers actually buying iPhones, is not certainly where Apple would want it to be. Do you think that this emphasis is correct on the part of Apple?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I would say the emphasis makes a lot of sense. It started with, kind of think of it as a little bit of like onboarding some of the supply chain away from China. For example, Foxconn, who's the maker of iPhones for Apple, has a facility in India. That kind of helped Apple avoid some excise duties in India, so it lowered the cost of manufacturing in India and also de-risked the supply chain. And then what you're seeing now is kind of like the natural evolution of that, which is like going on from manufacturing to having a retail store out there, because it is a big market. It's kind of like, you could argue that like China 10 years ago or whatever it might be, and that has huge potential. I would say that it does skew more towards the lower end of the phones today, but there's a potential that it could move more towards like the premium models on the hardware side and eventually get more traction on the services also for Apple.
Yeah, it sounded like they were really banking on or hoping that the growth of the middle class in India would push some of those consumers towards the more premium models. But for right now, and what you're mentioning and seeing in the pricing landscape and where consumers in the region are gravitating to lower cost models, does Apple have a secondary market problem on its hands in the region while it's trying to break into India and take on more market share?
I don't think they necessarily have a secondary market problem. I would say, like I mentioned earlier, I think one of the issues they had in the past was the iPhones used to be very highly priced in India. For example, it was always cheaper to get a phone in the US and take it to India than actually buying one in India. And a lot of that was because the manufacturing was not happening in India. It was imported from Foxconn in China, and there was an excise duty added to it. I think it was like somewhere in the range of 25% or something. So now you eliminate that excise duty because you're manufacturing domestically. So that automatically helps you keep the cost down. I think the bigger question of will the market there or the customer demand migrate from lower end to premium models, I think it's a fair enough question. It does skew towards the lower end, but I think there's a potential, as Tim Cook explained, that as the middle class grows and gets bigger and larger, there's a potential that they would start gravitating more towards the higher end or the premium models like the iPhone Pro and the Pro Max.
To sort of zoom out a little bit, Krish, how long will Apple investors have to wait for sort of another leg of growth, another growth driver? I mean, the India proposition is a longer-term proposition, really. So over the near term, is it something that we see reaccelerate this year, next year, and what's going to be the catalyst for that reacceleration?
Yeah, I know it's kind of interesting. I think that's kind of been a question, I would say, for the better part of the last 5 to 10 years. Yeah. The argument has always been that, the iPhone was kind of a home run. They never had anything since then. But the flip side is, if you see, the iPhone is a very sticky install base, so that definitely helps them, monetize a lot of those install base users, and that can help actually fund growth in the non-iPhone business, which is being largely targeted towards the services. Now, keep in mind, some of the new product introduction, for example, AirPods, which came out a few years ago, quickly grew into like a $15 billion revenue business. And I think where people tend to mistake it is the fact that, there is no single home run kind of a product for Apple, but there are multiple different avenues which help the company continue to grow. Whether you look at services is actually a confluence of music, Apple Care, Apple Pay, gaming downloads, Google Tag, advertising, etc. So there are multiple vectors there. And also on the hardware side, besides the iPhone, you do have, the AirPods, the watch, the Mac, the iPads, etc. So I would say that besides the iPhone, there is no one single home run. But if you add all of the remaining together, you've seen the company grow from being like, a few hundred billion in revenue a few years ago to almost 400 billion in revenue today.
Krish, all earnings season, we've been listening to these calls from the tech CEOs and even some CEOs outside of tech that have talked about AI. And for Apple, it wasn't something that was part of their talking points or their prepared remarks. They had to get asked about it, and at which point Tim Cook essentially said, yeah, we're keeping an eye on it. There's a lot of issues to be sorted out, but they view AI as a huge kind of weaving into products, opportunity and weaving that into products on a thoughtful basis. What does that signal to you about how Apple is going to kind of keep doing its own thing and wait to see how the market responds to AI?
Yeah, it's a good question. Apple historically has been more, I would say, call it risk averse in terms of introducing new technology. Even when you go back to iPhone, some of the incremental technology benefits they added they were not the first to do it. And a lot of that is because they do tend to make sure that the technology is solid when they try to put it together in either the 100 millions of devices, etc. So I think from that standpoint, I think Tim Cook's answer is probably I would say, the right way of looking at it, which is they probably have a program, they probably are doing something. There's nothing to talk about it today. There's been rumors that they might start using some AI in their healthcare offering. So it's kind of I think they do have a lot of opportunities, but Apple has historically never spoken about new products used a brand new technology unless they feel like it's not going to impact their, bread and butter business.
So when we're looking across the different segments right now for Apple, you mentioned services. Services was one of the only segments that actually saw growth year over year. The other one was the iPhone. So in this time period of macroeconomic challenges that they talked about on the call, how much further out do you foresee that being a larger issue for the segments like Mac, segments like iPad, and wearables even?
Sure. It's interesting because I think services has held up pretty well. The argument is always that as we kind of go into a recession or a slowdown, people are going to start getting more frugal and they're going to start trimming, paying $3 for that service or $5, $5.99 for monthly service for something else. You really haven't seen that quite happen. I think where you're seeing the weakness in service has been more on the digital advertising side and some gaming. So that's kind of more, I would say, not a consumer-related impact, but more of a bigger picture impact. The second one is in terms of the iPad and the Mac slowdown. Keep in mind, they did have, I think it's going against tough compares last year. They did have a brand new model. And then also on the Mac, they kind of came out with their, in-house chip, like the M3, M4, MX, instead of using Intel chips anymore. So I think that kind of drove a huge surge last year. So you're kind of going against that compared today. But in general, I would say that the iPhone and the services have sounded to be much more resilient than people thought. In fact, part of the pushback I get from investors is the bear thesis, which is when you head into the second half of this year, people do worry about iPhone numbers. And the reason is that if you look at financial services and tech companies laying off a lot of employees, those are typically the iPhone purchasers, and people do worry that there's a risk of iPhone slowdown in the back half. We haven't seen any of that yet. Obviously, we do not have the visibility into back half yet, but at the same time, that's one big concern some investors have.
All right, well, with the resilient services business, maybe they should start a dating app service next, perhaps. We'll see. We'll call it Blue Bubble or something like that. I don't know. TD Cowen Managing Director, Krish Sankar, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Appreciate it.